I didn't plan to stop at Waldo Lake for more than a night. That was the truth I kept repeating to myself as I turned the Volkswagen off the forest road and felt the tires crunch into volcanic gravel. One night. Long enough to sleep, boil water for coffee, and reset my head before pushing north again. Waldo had a reputation for clarity, the kind of lake so clean it reflected the sky with humiliating precision, and I told myself I needed that kind of order. A place where things lined up the way they were supposed to. The van settled into a primitive pullout ringed with lodgepole pine. No hookups, no cell signal. Just a metal fire ring, a picnic table scarred with old knife marks, and the lake a short walk through the trees. When I opened the sliding door, the air felt wrong for August. Not cold exactly, more like it had been refrigerated and forgotten. It smelled thin, almost metallic, like rain that never arrived. I stood there longer than necessary, listening. Wind threaded through the needles with a low, steady hiss that reminded me of static between radio stations. I reached up and turned the van's radio knob out of habit. Nothing. Just the same hiss, slightly louder, as if the forest had leaned closer. Waldo Lake didn't look real when I first saw it. The water was so still it erased depth. Clouds hovered below my feet, inverted and precise. And for a second my stomach tightened the way it does when you misjudge a step on stairs. I crouched and skimmed my fingers across the surface. The reflection fractured, then reassembled itself too quickly, like it had been waiting. I'd read somewhere, some blog post or trip report, that Waldo was considered functionally sterile. No fish, no algae bloom. A lake stripped down to the idea of water. I tried to remember where I'd read it, but the source slid away, the harder I reached. The post might have mentioned something else too. A warning, maybe. Or a joke that didn't land. By the time I walked back to the campsite, dusk had begun to flatten the colors. I cooked quietly, listening to the hiss of the stove mirror the wind. Every sound felt doubled, like it arrived once through my ears and again through my chest. When the light finally thinned to a blue-gray smear, I closed the van and locked the doors, embarrassed by the click. I slept poorly. The van creaked as it always did, but the noises came in patterns I couldn't predict. 3 soft ticks along the roof, a pause, then 2, closer to the windshield. I told myself it was pine cones or temperature shift, but the rhythm felt intentional, like someone testing for response. At some point, I woke to the sensation of movement without motion. The van was still, but my body felt as if it were drifting. I stared at the ceiling and waited for the feeling to pass. Instead, it intensified, accompanied by that same static hiss, now threaded with something almost like voices. Not words, just the suggestion of cadence. Morning came without the usual relief. The light outside looked overexposed, as if the contrast had been turned too high. I stepped out and walked back to the lake, driven by a need I didn't fully understand. The surface was calm again, but the sky it reflected wasn't the one above me. The clouds below were heavier, stacked in thick bands that didn't exist overhead. I straightened quickly, heart ticking. When I looked again, the reflections matched. I laughed once, too loud, and the sound died instantly, swallowed by the trees. Later that morning, a man walked past my campsite on the trail. Late 50s, maybe. Forest Service cap bleached nearly white. He nodded, slowed, and glanced toward the lake. "Still doing that?" he asked, like we'd been mid-conversation. "Doing what?" I said. He smiled thinly. "Never mind. Probably nothing." He started to walk again, then stopped. "If you hear your name out there, don't answer." I waited for him to explain, but he didn't. Just adjusted his pack strap and disappeared down the trail that, according to my map, looped back to the south shore. I watched until the trees closed behind him. When I looked down, I realized my hands were shaking. I spent the afternoon trying to ground myself in small tasks. Cleaning, checking tire pressure, reviewing the map. The map bothered me more than it should have. The trail lines didn't match what I remembered walking that morning. Switchbacks where there had been none. A spur labeled with a name I didn't recognize, then couldn't find again when I looked back. The wind picked up in the late afternoon, bringing with it a smell like wet stone and old leaves. It triggered a memory I couldn't place, standing somewhere dry and open, hearing echoes that came back wrong. I told myself that was nonsense. Waldo wasn't a desert, but the phrase surfaced anyway, uninvited. The desert echoes, but not always in the direction you expect. As evening closed in, the lake began to change. Not dramatically, just enough that I liked my eyes. The surface darkened unevenly, as if shadows were passing beneath it. The reflection lagged behind the sky, updating seconds too late. When I shifted my weight, the mirrored clouds rippled though the water hadn't been touched. I backed away, pulse thudding, and nearly collided with the picnic table. Its surface was cold, colder than the air. Someone had carved symbols into the wood years ago. Initials, dates, a rough triangle with a line through it. I traced the shape without thinking and felt a prickle of recognition. I'd seen it before, on a forum screenshot maybe, or the corner of a video thumbnail that had since been taken down. That night, the voices returned, louder this time. They rode the wind, slipping between the trees and pressing against the van's thin walls. I couldn't make out words, but the cadence matched speech. Question and answer, call and response. At one point, I was sure I heard my own breathing echoed back to me from the wrong side of the door. I sat upright, keys in my hand, debating flight. But the idea of driving felt impossible, like the road might not accept me the way it had before. Outside, the lake reflected a sky full of unfamiliar stars, constellations misaligned, slightly off like a map remembered incorrectly. Something knocked once on the side of the van. Not hard, just enough to be polite. I didn't answer. The knock came again, softer, in a rhythm I recognized without knowing why. My name hovered on the edge of hearing, never quite forming, braided into the static hiss that filled the air. I stayed awake until the sky lightened, afraid that if I slept, I'd wake somewhere else, or worse, see my reflection stand up and walk away without me. Morning didn't fix anything. It just rearranged the problem so it looked solvable again. The sky above Waldo Lake was clear, painfully blue, the kind of morning people photograph and caption with words like pristine and untouched. I stood at the shoreline with my hands shoved deep into my jacket pockets and watched the water copy it perfectly. Too perfectly. The reflection felt sharper than the source, like the lake was the original and the sky was the imitation. I told myself I'd imagined the stars. Fatigue does that. So does isolation. I repeated those explanations while I packed the van with unnecessary urgency, knocking my elbow on the doorframe, spilling coffee grounds onto the gravel. Each small mistake tightened the knot in my chest. I kept glancing toward the water, half expecting to see something move independently of me. It didn't. That almost made it worse. I decided to walk the trail again, the one the older man had taken. Movement helps when your thoughts start looping. The map said the loop was just under 4 miles. Easy. Familiar terrain. I folded the paper and slid it into my back pocket, then hesitated and unfolded it again, committing the lines to memory. The way you do when you're afraid the page might lie to you later. The forest was quieter than the day before. Not silent, never silent, but muted, like someone had wrapped the sounds in cloth. My boots pressed into pumice and pine needles without the usual crunch. After 10 minutes, I realized I couldn't hear the lake anymore. No wind off the water. No distant lapping. Just that faint static hiss, persistent as breath. The trail marker appeared where I expected it to. Same weathered post, same faded numbers, but the arrow pointed the wrong direction. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it, waiting for my memory to correct itself. I was sure, absolutely sure, that arrow had pointed left yesterday. Now it angled right, deeper into the trees. I checked the map. The map insisted the arrow was right. The map had always insisted. I turned the post with both hands. It resisted, then moved with a sound like wet wood tearing. When it settled, the arrow pointed left again. Behind me, something exhaled. I spun around, heart hammering, but there was nothing there. Just trees, just shadow. I laughed, sharp and breathless, and kept walking, refusing to look back at the marker. The trail narrowed as it climbed, the ground sloping gently upward until the lake should have fallen out of sight. It didn't. Through gaps in the trees, I kept catching glimpses of it, always at the same distance, always reflecting the same slice of sky. It felt like walking on a treadmill painted to look like a forest. After an hour, my legs burned and my sense of direction dissolved. The trail curved, then doubled back on itself in a way that made no sense. I stopped to rest and noticed something etched into a basalt outcrop beside the path. The same triangle, the same line through it. Fresh this time, pale stone exposed beneath the dark surface. I didn't remember crouching, but suddenly I was, fingers hovering inches from the mark. The air smelled wrong again, metallic like before a storm that never comes. A memory brushed past me, slippery and incomplete. A different place. Heat shimmering, a horizon that wouldn't stay still. The same symbol scratched into something that should have eroded it away. My phone buzzed in my pocket, nearly making me shout. No signal, but a notification banner hung on the screen anyway. A video file. No sender. No timestamp. Just a still frame. Waldo Lake, shot from my campsite. The van was in the frame. The door was open. I deleted it immediately. The file disappeared too easily, like it had been waiting. When I checked my storage, there was no trace it had ever existed. That was when I heard my name. It wasn't loud. It didn't come from any particular direction. It was folded into the static hiss shaped just enough that my brain recognized it and filled in the rest. I clamped my hands over my ears and dropped to one knee, breath coming fast, vision tunneling. "If you hear your name," the man had said, "don't answer." I didn't. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood and stayed silent until the sound lost interest and drifted away. I don't remember the walk back. I remember fragments, the way the light shifted without clouds, the sense of passing the same tree twice, the smell of old water clinging to my clothes. When the campsite finally appeared, it felt less like relief and more like returning to a room where an argument had paused mid-sentence. The van door was closed. Locked. Exactly as I'd left it. Inside, everything was wrong by inches. My notebook lay open on the table, though I was sure I'd stowed it. Pages were filled with my handwriting, tight, slanted, but I didn't remember writing any of it. Dates that didn't align. Observations about reflections, about echoes, about places that repeat because they're waiting for something to change. One line was underlined so hard the paper tore. The water is not a mirror. IT is a window that remembers you back. I slammed the notebook shut and sat there, head in my hands, fighting the urge to drive blindly until the forest thinned into something else. Panic pressed in, cold and precise. Every instinct screamed that staying was dangerous, that something here was practicing being me. The lake outside shifted color as the afternoon wore on, deepening into a bruised blue that didn't match the sky. Wind rose and fell in irregular pulses, carrying snatches of sound that almost resolved into words. Once I thought I heard laughter. Mine, distorted, stretched thin. At dusk, headlights appeared on the road. Relief hit so hard my knees went weak. A ranger truck pulled into the turnout, dust curling behind it. A woman stepped out, younger than I expected, her expression careful. "You planning on staying another night?" she asked. "I was thinking about leaving," I said. My voice shook. I didn't try to hide it. She nodded slowly. "That's usually when people do." I waited for her to say more. She didn't. Just glanced toward the lake, then back at me. Her eyes lingered a second too long on my reflection in the van's window. "Maps aren't reliable here," she added. "Neither are recordings." "Why?" I asked. She hesitated. "Because some places don't like being documented. They push back." The wind gusted, carrying that static hiss with it, louder now, threaded with cadence. The ranger's radio crackled at her shoulder, spitting out fragments of voices that didn't belong to any channel. She turned it off without looking. "If you go," she said, "don't look at the water on your way out." I nodded, keys already in my hand. My reflection in the window nodded back, a fraction of a second late. I didn't say goodbye to the lake. I didn't give myself time to second-guess the ranger's warning. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled onto the narrow road with my eyes fixed straight ahead, like the windshield was the only thing holding the world together. The forest pressed close immediately. Trees leaned in with a familiarity that felt rehearsed, branches arching overhead to form a tunnel that swallowed the sky. The road surface changed under the tires without warning, gravel to packed dirt to something smoother, almost paved, then back again. Each transition sent a shiver up through the steering wheel, like the van was passing over seams. I told myself not to look left. I told myself not to check the mirrors. The static hiss followed me. Not from the radio, I'd turned it off completely, but from everywhere else. From the vents, from the door seams, from inside my skull. It rose and fell with no pattern I could map, sometimes thinning enough that I could almost hear something underneath it. Almost. The road should have curved south after a mile. Instead, it sloped gently downward, straight as a ruler, longer than any stretch I remembered driving in. My speedometer needle twitched, then dropped to 0, even though the van kept moving. I tapped the dash. Nothing changed. That was when the smell returned. Wet stone. Old water. A scent that didn't belong in a forest this dry. It filled the cab, heavy and intimate, like breath against the back of my neck. With it came the sense of being watched, not from outside, but from somewhere just behind my eyes, like a second perspective trying to align with my own. I made the mistake of glancing at the rearview mirror. The road behind me wasn't empty. The lake stretched there instead, impossibly wide, filling the space between the trees as if the forest had stepped aside to make room for it. The water was smooth, darker than before, reflecting a sky that was not the one above my head. The clouds in the mirror moved against the wind, sliding laterally as if dragged by something unseen. And in the reflection, just for a moment, I saw the van driving away without me. I slammed my eyes forward, heart detonating in my chest. The engine sputtered in protest, then steadied. My hands were numb on the wheel. I focused on the white scar of road ahead, counting breaths, grounding myself in motion. Not real, I said out loud. My voice sounded thin, distorted, like it had traveled a long distance to reach me. Just keep going. The phrase echoed back. Wrong. Not from behind. From ahead. The forest began to repeat itself. The same fallen log, the same lightning-scarred pine, the same bend in the road that wasn't a bend at all, just a suggestion of one. Each time I passed them, my sense of time smeared further. Minutes stretched, then collapsed. The light shifted without warning, afternoon bleeding into something closer to evening, then snapping back again. I remembered the notebook, the line I hadn't written, a window that remembers you back. My phone buzzed again. I didn't touch it. I didn't even look down. But the screen lit the cab anyway, reflected faintly in the windshield. A text preview scrolled across, letters assembling themselves too slowly. You left something. Another buzz. We can hold it for you. The road dipped sharply, and the van coasted without input, gravity pulling me forward into a clearing that shouldn't have been there. The trees fell away, revealing a turnout identical to my campsite. Same fire ring, same table, same scars in the wood. The van rolled to a stop on its own. My chest constricted so tightly I thought I might pass out. I sat there, trembling, out of every rational part of me screaming to reverse, to force motion, to break the loop by refusing it. But another part, quieter, deeper, felt a pull, a terrible curiosity braided with recognition. The lake was closer here, just beyond the trees. I could feel it, the way you feel pressure change before a storm. I stepped out of the van. The air was colder than it should have been, biting through my jacket. The static hiss thickened immediately, swelling until it felt almost physical, like standing too close to a live wire. Each step toward the water came with the sense of walking into a memory that wasn't mine alone. At the shoreline I stopped. The reflection waited. It showed the clearing behind me, the van, the trees, but the sky was wrong again. Darker. Heavier. The clouds pressed low, swollen with something they refused to release. And there at the edge of the reflected water stood a figure I recognized with a clarity that hurt. It was me. Not as I was now, as I'd been when I arrived, cleaner, less afraid. My reflection self watched me with an expression I couldn't read, then glanced past me toward the forest like it had somewhere else to be. "No," I whispered. The word barely made a sound. The water rippled for the first time since I'd arrived at Waldo Lake. Not from wind, from within. Concentric rings spread outward, distorting the reflected figure until it fragmented, reassembled, then stepped forward. I staggered back as a hand broke the surface. The shock of it was physical, the smell intensifying, the sound spiking, my vision blurring at the edges. The hand looked like mine, down to the scar across the knuckle, but the skin was too smooth, stretched tight, as if it had never known weather or age. A voice rose from the water. Not spoken, carried. "You don't fit anymore," it said. Not in words, but in understanding. "We can keep what you were." Behind me, something knocked once on metal. The van. That same polite rhythm. Panic detonated fully then, burning away hesitation. I turned and ran, lungs screaming, boots slipping on gravel as I tore back toward the driver's door. I fumbled the keys, dropped them, nearly sobbed as I scrabbled to retrieve them with shaking hands. The knock came again. Closer this time. I didn't look back. The engine roared to life as if relieved. I slammed the door, threw the van into gear, and floored it. The clearing vanished behind me, swallowed by trees that snapped back into place like nothing had ever been there. The road accepted me this time. It bent, it climbed, it narrowed and widened in ways that made sense. The static hiss faded gradually, thinning until it was just wind again, then nothing at all. When the forest finally broke and the land opened into familiar highway, I laughed and cried at the same time, the sound ugly and uncontrolled. I drove for hours without stopping. I didn't check my phone until I hit a town with too many lights and too much noise to let my thoughts wander. There were no messages, no videos, no trace of anything I'd seen on that road. Weeks later, safe at home, I tried to research Waldo Lake again. The blog post I remembered was gone. The forum thread returned a dead link. Even archived maps showed subtle differences. Trails rerouted, labels missing, the shoreline smoothed into something less specific. Sometimes late at night, I hear static when the house is quiet. Sometimes I catch my reflection in dark windows and feel a flicker of delay, like something on the other side is still deciding whether to move. I don't camp near lakes anymore. And when I think about the desert, about echoes and how they travel, I understand something I didn't before. Some places don't send your voice back to you. They keep it. I didn't come to Mount Bachelor to disappear. That's important to say up front, because what happened there makes it sound like I was already looking for a way to erase myself. I wasn't. I had a name, a job, a small but stubborn sense of routine, and a used Volkswagen camper that still smelled faintly of coolant and old pine no matter how many times I aired it out. I came because I needed quiet. A reset. Somewhere I could hear my own thoughts again without them bouncing off deadlines, screens, or other people's expectations. Mount Bachelor sits east of the Cascades, where the forest thins and the land starts to harden. It's not quite desert, not quite alpine, this in-between zone of pumice soil, wind-shaped trees, and wide, empty sky. The campground I chose wasn't on the main recreation maps anymore. Camp Echoes, it was called. The name felt like a joke at first, the kind of poetic branding that doesn't survive budget cuts. But it still showed up if you zoomed far enough in on an old Forest Service PDF I found buried in a forum thread from 2016. Someone had commented under it, "That place still there?" No replies. When I arrived, there was no sign, just a narrow spur road branching off the main forest route, marked only by a leaning post with a faded yellow blaze. My paper map showed nothing. My phone map flickered, reoriented, then gave up and went gray. I remember thinking that was a relief. The campsite itself paused, like someone had stepped away in the middle of a sentence, fire rings cold but intact, picnic tables bleached to bone color, a vault toilet that didn't smell as bad as it should have. The wind moved through the lodgepole pines in slow, repetitive waves, making a sound that wasn't quite a sigh and wasn't quite a voice. I parked the VW in Site 3. I remember that clearly because later I would find the marker for Site 3 nailed to a tree half a mile downslope, facing the wrong direction. The first night was almost peaceful. Almost. I cooked canned chili on the little stove, ate it straight from the pot, and watched the light drain out of the forest. The temperature dropped faster than expected. My breath fogged the windshield from the inside, even after I turned on the heater. That should have been my first warning. The heater worked fine everywhere else. When I finally lay down, the quiet pressed in hard enough that my ears rang. Then somewhere after midnight, I heard my name. Not shouted, not whispered, just spoken, clearly, as if someone were standing outside the van, reading it off a clipboard. I sat up so fast I cracked my head on the cabinet. I waited, listened. The wind moved again, same rhythm, same long exhale. No footsteps, no crunch of gravel, no flashlight beams slicing through the windows. I told myself it was a half dream, the kind where your brain drags familiar sounds into unfamiliar places. But then it happened again. My name. Same tone, same distance. No emotion attached to it at all. I didn't answer. That felt instinctive, like pulling your hand back from a hot stove. Instead, I turned on the radio. Static. I twisted the dial. AM, FM, weather band. All static. Under it, though, faint, irregular. I thought I heard something else. A pattern. Like someone tapping a microphone, then stopping. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. I shut it off. The next morning, the campground looked unchanged, but something in me had shifted. I kept catching myself glancing toward the tree line, waiting for movement that never came. When I walked to the vault toilet, I noticed a smell that didn't belong, sweet and metallic, like overheated wires. It followed me, then vanished as soon as I tried to pinpoint it. On the door of the toilet, carved deep and old, was a symbol I didn't recognize, a rough triangle intersected by a horizontal line. Below it, someone had scratched words so faint I had to tilt my head to read them. Don't answer the second time. I laughed out loud when I saw that. A short, sharp sound that died immediately, swallowed by the trees. I told myself it was a prank, leftover teenage nonsense, but I didn't use the toilet. I went back to the van and locked the door. Around noon, another RV pulled in. An older couple in a fifth wheel, Oregon plates. They waved. I waved back, relief loosening something in my chest I hadn't realized was clenched. Normal people meant normal explanations. We talked briefly the way campers do. Weather, road conditions. I mentioned Camp Echoes, asked if they'd been there before. The man frowned. Is that what they're calling it now? Now? I asked. He hesitated, then shrugged. Used to be something else. Echo Ridge, maybe. Or, no, doesn't matter. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You hear things at night yet? I waited for the punchline. It didn't come. Just the wind, I said. Good, he replied. Keep it that way. They left before dusk. I watched their taillights vanish down the spur road, a thin red line swallowed by trees. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, like the campground was holding its breath. That night, the knocking started. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, not loud, not soft, human-paced. I stayed frozen in my bunk, heart hammering so hard it shook the mattress. The knocks came again. Same rhythm, same force. Exactly the way I would knock on someone else's door, trying not to be rude. I didn't move. I didn't speak. After a long minute, the knocks stopped. Then my name came back, closer this time, not outside. Inside my head, layered over my own thoughts, using my voice. I pressed my hands over my ears until my arms ached. In the morning, there were no footprints, no marks on the door. But taped to the outside of the windshield was a printed sheet of paper, the kind you'd pull from an office copier. Black and white, grainy. It was a map. Not of the campground as it existed, but as I remembered it. Every site numbered the way my mind insisted they were, not the way the Forest Service signs claimed. Site 3, exactly where I'd parked. A trail marked in pencil leading away from it, looping back on itself, labeled in cramped handwriting, Echo Stays. I stood there a long time, staring at the paper, trying to remember if I'd printed it myself. I couldn't remember doing that. I couldn't remember a lot of things, actually, including when I'd last answered my name out loud. I left the map taped to the windshield longer than I should have. Part of me kept waiting for it to change. Ink bleeding, lines rearranging themselves, something obvious and undeniable that would let me say this is impossible and act accordingly. But it stayed stubbornly normal. Cheap paper, smudged toner, a coffee ring stain in one corner I didn't remember making. I folded it and slid it into the glove compartment, telling myself I'd compare it to my other maps later. That was a lie. I already knew it wouldn't match. The day warmed quickly, but the cold inside the van lingered. The heater still blew lukewarm air that smelled faintly burned, like dust hitting an old coil. When I stepped outside, the smell followed me again, that same sweet metallic edge. It came strongest near the trees behind my sight, where the ground dipped and the shadows pooled even at noon. I tried to distract myself with normal tasks. Dump trash, refill water, check tire pressure. Each action felt rehearsed, like muscle memory stepping in where thought refused to go. Still, every so often, I'd feel a pressure behind my eyes, a sense that if I turned my head too quickly, I'd catch myself doing something I hadn't decided to do. Around mid-afternoon, I heard voices. Not clear ones, not words, just cadence. Rise and fall. Conversation without content, drifting through the trees like radio chatter just out of range. I followed it without realizing I was moving until the crunch of pumice under my boots sounded wrong. Too loud, too close. The trail wasn't on my map. Either map. It was narrow, barely a suggestion of passage, but it curved exactly the way the printed sheet had shown. I stood there, heart pounding, and told myself I would only walk a few yards, just enough to see where it went. The forest changed subtly as I moved. Trees spaced farther apart, wind falling into a steady, repetitive rhythm that synced uncomfortably with my breathing. I became aware of a low hum under everything, like distant machinery or a power line vibrating through bedrock. That's when I saw the structure. It might once have been a ranger station or a maintenance shed. Concrete pad. One wall still standing, the others collapsed inward like a rib cage. On the remaining wall, faded almost to nothing, was the same symbol from the toilet door, the triangle, bisected. Someone was standing inside. I stopped so abruptly my knee locked. The figure didn't turn. Average height, neutral posture, hands at their sides. From behind, they looked like me. Same jacket, same hat, same worn shoulders. I said my name before I could stop myself. The figure's head tilted just slightly. The sound that followed wasn't a voice. It was a feedback shriek, sharp enough to make my vision blur. I stumbled back, hands clamped over my ears, and when I looked again, the structure was empty. I ran. I don't remember the path back. I remember falling, scraping my palms, bursting out into the clearing of the campground, gasping like I'd been underwater. The van was exactly where I'd left it. The sun sat low enough now to stretch shadows across the sights, long and distorted. On my door handle, carved fresh into the paint, was my name. Only it wasn't spelled the way I wrote it. One letter was wrong. I spent that evening inside the van, lights off, engine off, wrapped in a blanket that never quite warmed. I tried calling for help when my phone briefly showed a bar of service, but the call wouldn't connect. The screen flickered instead, displaying a notification from a video app I didn't remember installing. New upload available. The thumbnail was a still image of Camp Echoes, taken from above. Site 3 circled in red. The title read, "He Answers Eventually." When I tapped it, the video was gone. Account not found. Error 404. My watch buzzed, startled me enough that I nearly dropped it. A text message from an unknown number. You didn't use to hesitate. I shut the phone off and buried it under the seat. That night, the knocking returned. Three knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. This time, it came from inside the van, from the bathroom door. I stared at it, every nerve screaming. The handle twitched, just barely. I smelled coolant and hot metal and something else underneath. Old paper, maybe, or dust from long-closed rooms. "Stop," I said. My voice sounded wrong. Flat. Borrowed. The knocking answered, matching my cadence exactly. Then my name came again, but distorted now, stretched, spoken with the wrong emphasis, like someone who'd only heard it secondhand. I realized then what the warning meant. Don't answer the second time, because the first time teaches it how. I didn't sleep. I counted breaths, counted heartbeats. When dawn finally leaked through the windows, the bathroom door stood open. Empty. No marks, no sign anything had happened. But the glove compartment hung open. The map was gone. I decided to leave. I didn't pack carefully. I didn't check anything twice. I turned the key, praying the engine would catch, and for a moment it didn't. Just a hollow clicking that echoed too loudly in the quiet campground. Then the engine turned over. As I pulled onto the spur road, I passed the leaning post with the yellow blaze. Someone had added fresh paint beneath it. A word, still wet enough to glisten. Echo. The road twisted in ways I didn't remember. Switchbacks where there hadn't been any, landmarks out of order. At one point, I passed the same fallen log 3 times, each from a different angle. The radio crackled to life on its own, static layered with a voice that almost sounded like the older man from the fifth wheel. Maps lie, it said. Names don't. I slammed it off. When I finally reached pavement, the relief was so intense it made me lightheaded. Civilization returned in pieces, cell towers, road signs, the distant hum of traffic. I drove until my hands stopped shaking, then kept driving anyway. I don't answer my name anymore. Not out loud. Not when someone calls from another room. Not when a stranger says it like they're sure they know me. I use a shortened version now, a nickname that doesn't quite fit, but fits better than silence. Sometimes, late at night, I hear knocking, 3 taps, from the inside of my apartment walls, from the dash of the van when I park it too long without moving. And sometimes when the wind moves just right, I catch that sweet metallic smell and think of a campground that doesn't exist on any map that stays the same. The desert echoes, just not in the direction you expect. I thought leaving would end it. That was the lie I needed in order to keep functioning. 1 foot in front of the other, gas station coffee, the dull comfort of freeway noise. I told myself Mount Bachelor was a sealed chapter, a story with an aftertaste, but no future pages. I even managed to believe it for a while. Weeks passed. The first sign that it hadn't let go came in the form of mail that wasn't addressed to my name. It was close. Close enough that the post office delivered it anyway. Same street, same apartment number, just not me. 1 letter wrong, like the carving on the van door. I stared at the envelope in the hallway under flickering fluorescent lights, feeling that pressure behind my eyes again, the subtle suggestion that if I picked it up, I would be agreeing to something. I left it there. By the time I came back from work, it was gone. That night, I dreamed of static. Not images. Not stories. Just sound. A thick, suffocating hiss threaded with almost words, rising and falling like breath. When I woke, my throat hurt, raw and sore, as if I'd been speaking all night. I checked my phone. 3 missed calls. Unknown number. The voicemail transcripts were blank. I started to notice gaps. Nothing dramatic at first. Small absences. I'd open a document at work and find paragraphs written in a tone I didn't recognize, using phrases I never used. A coworker asked if I'd finished that echo project yet. I didn't know what she meant. She looked confused, then unsettled, and said, "You told me about it last week. You were really specific." I asked her what I'd said. She hesitated. "You said, never mind, it was probably a joke." That was becoming a pattern, people deciding not to finish sentences around me. One evening, I searched Camp Echoes online. Nothing. The forum thread I'd found before was gone. The Forest Service PDF returned a dead link. Even cached pages showed errors, as if the campground had been edited out retroactively. But when I searched for Mount Bachelor disappearances, missing hikers, lost campers, abandoned vehicles, I found something else. A blog, or rather traces of one. Quoted snippets on other sites, broken image links, references without sources. The title appeared again and again in comment sections, usually followed by arguments or abrupt topic changes. Echo stays. One quoted line stopped me cold. "It doesn't steal you. It waits for you to stop insisting." The author name was redacted in every instance, replaced by a string of symbols that made my eyes slide off them. The dates didn't make sense. Some posts were supposedly from the early 2000s, others from last year. A few were time-stamped in the future. I shut the laptop when the room grew cold enough that my breath fogged. The knocking started again shortly after, not on doors this time, on routines. 3 taps in the rhythm of my morning alarm, but before it was set to go off. 3 knocks in the cadence of my neighbor's footsteps, but coming from the wrong direction. Patterns where patterns shouldn't be. Repetition without a source. I tried ignoring it, tried grounding myself in the physical world. Textures, temperatures, smells that belonged. But that sweet metallic scent began creeping into everything. My car, my clothes, my own hands sometimes, when I rubbed them together too long. One night, exhausted and shaking, I said my name into the bathroom mirror, just to see if it still felt like mine. The reflection didn't answer. It smiled a fraction of a second too late. I stopped looking at mirrors after that. The final confirmation came from the van. I hadn't driven it since Mount Bachelor. Part of me couldn't bring myself to sell it, but another part refused to get behind the wheel again. It sat in the apartment parking lot, collecting pollen and bird droppings, a familiar shape I avoided acknowledging, until I found the door unlocked. Inside, the air was colder than outside, thick with that same burned, sweet smell. The radio was on. Static. Under it, faint but unmistakable, was my voice, not speaking, practicing, repeating my name, over and over. Each time closer to the way I pronounced it. Each time better. On the passenger seat lay the map, creased differently now, the pencil trail darker, more confident. New markings branched off it, other loops, other sites, other names I didn't recognize but somehow knew were wrong. At the bottom, written neatly in ink that hadn't been there before, was a sentence. You can stop answering, or you can come back and correct it. I understood then. Not fully, but enough. Camp Echoes wasn't a place. Not exactly. It was a resonance. A gap between intention and response. It didn't take people who fought. It took people who hesitated, who doubted their own senses, just long enough for something else to step into the pause. Names were anchors. Maps were permissions. I left the van where it was, walked back to my apartment, packed what I needed, not much. On the kitchen counter, I wrote my name once, clearly, spelled the way it was supposed to be. Then I crossed it out. I took the earliest bus east. I don't know what I'll find when I reach the edge of the desert again. I don't know if Mount Bachelor will be where it was, or if Camp Echoes will remember me the way I remember it. But I know this. If I'm going to lose my name, I want to be there when it happens. Because echoes don't die on their own. They wait. The bus dropped me at a place that barely qualified as a stop. No station, no sign. Just a widening in the road where the asphalt cracked and gave way to gravel, the kind of place drivers slow down without knowing why. The driver didn't look at me when I got off. He shut the doors fast, like he was afraid I might change my mind and come back. The desert air was colder than it should have been, sharp enough to sting my lungs. The smell was there immediately. Faint, but unmistakable. Sweet, metallic, like overheated wires cooling in open space. I walked. There were no trails marked where I was going, but my feet knew the direction anyway. That was the most frightening part, not the isolation, not the quiet, but the certainty. The land flattened out, then slowly began to rise. Pumice underfoot again. Lodgepole pines appearing in loose clusters like thoughts that hadn't fully formed yet. By the time the forest thickened, dusk had already started to settle. Camp Echoes didn't announce itself. No leaning post this time. No yellow blaze. I stepped out of the trees and simply realized I was there. Fire rings, tables, the same bone-white wood, the same sense of a sentence paused mid-word. Only now there were more sights. Some were empty, some weren't. RVs stood dark and silent, scattered farther apart than comfort allowed. Not abandoned, too orderly for that, but waiting. Curtains drawn, doors closed. No footprints leading away. At what I remembered as Site 3, my Volkswagen waited. Cleaner than it had any right to be. Tires properly inflated, a faint warmth radiating from the hood as if it had been driven recently. I didn't approach it. The wind moved through the trees, and this time I didn't pretend it was just wind. The cadence was wrong, too deliberate, too measured. I heard fragments in it, syllables that brushed the edge of comprehension and slid away. My name surfaced among them, almost right. I followed the trail instead, the one that wasn't on any official map, the one the paper had insisted on. It led me back to the concrete structure, the collapsed ribs of walls half buried in ash-gray soil. The symbol was clearer now, darkened as if recently traced over. Someone had added another line beneath it, faint but deliberate, a mirror image. Inside the structure, a lantern burned. The light didn't flicker. It hummed, low and steady, matching the vibration I felt in my teeth. And standing beside it, facing away from me, was the figure I'd seen before. It turned slowly. Up close, the differences were obvious. The posture slightly off, the eyes tracking a fraction too smoothly, the mouth shaping expressions a beat late like a poorly synced video. But it wore my face well enough that my stomach twisted anyway. "You stopped answering," it said. My voice. Almost. "I stopped agreeing," I replied. My throat tightened around the words, but they came out steady. It tilted its head, studying me the way you'd examine a flawed tool. That wasn't the arrangement. I never made one. The hum deepened. The air pressed in, squeezing the space smaller, denser. Behind the figure, the lantern light revealed shapes scratched into the concrete floor. Names. Dozens of them. Some crossed out, some circled, some overwritten so many times they'd become illegible. Maps of people. "You don't need to stay," it said. "You just need to stop insisting on the wrong version." A memory surfaced then, not from Mount Bachelor, but from long before. Being a kid, calling into an empty house, hearing my own voice come back wrong through a hallway. The unease of it. The instinctive understanding that something answered because it could, not because it should. I stepped closer. The smell intensified, thick enough to taste. Static crawled along my skin. The lantern flared, and for a split second I saw reflections layered over reflections, faces overlapping, mouths opening in unison. "I'm not here to correct you," I said. "I'm here to take something back." It frowned. The expression didn't fit. "You can't. Once a name echoes long enough—" I know," I interrupted. "That's why I brought silence." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the paper I'd folded there hours ago. Not the map, the other thing, my name. Crossed out. I tore it in half. Then again, until the pieces were too small to be words anymore. I dropped them at its feet. The hum fractured. Not stopped, fractured, splitting into irregular pulses that fought each other. The figure recoiled, not in pain, but in confusion. Its mouth moved, shaping syllables it couldn't anchor. Around us, the campground responded. Doors slammed in the distance. Radios shrieked and died. Wind rushed in from every direction at once, carrying voices that unraveled mid-sound. The lantern guttered, finally flickering like a real flame. The figure's face began to blur, not dissolve, but smear, like charcoal dragged across paper. "You'll be nothing," it said, and for the first time fear threaded the words. I thought about that, about the weight of a name, the way it pulls attention, expectation, memory, about how much of myself I'd already given up trying to live up to it. "Maybe," I said, "but I'll be quiet." The lantern went out. When light returned, it was morning. The structure was empty, the floor bare, no names, no symbols, just cracked concrete and cold ash. The trail behind me looked ordinary, just a narrow cut through trees leading nowhere special. Camp Echoes was still there, but diminished somehow, smaller, less certain. My van was gone, so were the other RVs. I walked back to the road without looking over my shoulder. Months have passed since then. I don't live where I used to. I don't work under the name I was given. I answer to something simple now, something that doesn't echo far enough to come back wrong. Most nights are quiet, but sometimes when the wind is just right, I hear a familiar cadence trying to remember itself. 3 taps, a pause. 3 taps. It never gets a response. And somewhere east of the Cascades, in a place that shifts when you're not watching, Camp Echoes listens, waiting for someone else to hesitate long enough to teach it a new name. The first thing that should have warned me was how clean the air felt when it shouldn't have been. Not fresh, not cold, clean like something had been erased. I was easing my Volkswagen Westfalia off a narrow forest road in the southern stretch of Klamath National Forest, tires crunching softly over gravel that looked older than the map I'd trusted to get there. The van's engine ticked as I shut it off, the sound oddly loud against the stillness that followed. No wind moving through the canopy, no birds calling out territorial claims, just a hollow quiet that sat there, patient as if the forest was holding its breath. My name is Aaron. I was 32 at the time, living in Northern California, splitting my weeks between remote contract work and long solo drives meant to burn the restlessness out of my system. The Volkswagen wasn't a lifestyle statement, it was a tool. It let me disappear for a few days without fully vanishing. That mattered to me more than I like to admit. This trip wasn't supposed to be dramatic. 2 nights, a reset. I'd coordinated loosely with 2 others I knew through regional camping groups. Not close friends, more like familiar faces you trust because they've survived similar roads. Lena arrived first. 28, local to the area, volunteered part-time with trail maintenance crews. She knew the forest in the way locals do, not through facts, but through habits. Which roads to avoid after rain, which valleys held cold longer than expected, which places felt wrong without being able to explain why. Marcus showed up not long after. 35. Recently separated. Quiet in the way people get when they're tired of explaining themselves. He drove a dusty Subaru with plates from out of state and unloaded his gear efficiently, like he didn't plan on staying anywhere long enough to get attached. We chose the campsite because it didn't advertise itself. No sign. No metal fire ring, just a clearing where the trees pulled back slightly, revealing a shallow bowl of compacted earth and old pine needles. A dry creek bed cut along one edge, its stones bleached and smooth like they'd been handled too often. Lena said it was unofficial but known. That word should have settled me. Instead, it lodged somewhere behind my ribs. As we parked, I noticed the ground first. A thin gray dust clung to the roots and rocks, collected in shallow depressions like sediment after a flood. I knelt and brushed my fingers through it. It felt dry, almost silky. Ash, I thought. But there was no smell, no charred wood, no bite in the air, just pine, damp earth, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't place. I didn't mention it, not yet. We set up quickly. The light was already tilting toward evening, that sharp forest dusk where colors drain fast and shadows thicken before you realize they're there. The temperature dropped as soon as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Klamath cold doesn't negotiate. It arrives fully formed. Conversation stayed light. Routes we'd driven, campsites we'd loved and sworn off. Lena talked about a washout farther north that had stranded a couple of hikers earlier that summer. Marcus mostly listened, eyes drifting to the trees as if he expected them to answer back. The forest stayed quiet, no insects, no distant water. Even the wind seemed unsure, stirring briefly and then stopping like it had forgotten its role. That was when Marcus asked, casually, if there were any controlled burns scheduled nearby. Lena shook her head, said not this late in the season. Not with conditions the way they were. She said it confidently, but she didn't smile. We ate standing up, leaning against bumpers, plates balanced on knees. I kept catching that faint metallic note in the air, more noticeable when I stopped moving. It didn't belong to any fire I'd ever known. It reminded me of overheated electronics, of insulation warming where it shouldn't. As darkness settled fully, the clearing felt smaller. The trees didn't close in so much as lean, their trunks angled just enough to suggest attention. My headlamp beam seemed to get swallowed faster than usual, the light stopping short instead of stretching out the way it normally does in open forest. We decided against a fire. Not because of restrictions, but because none of us felt like it. The cold pressed closer, but the idea of flame felt wrong, like it might wake something that was content to stay unnoticed. By 10, we'd retreated to our respective shelters. Lena zipped into her tent near the tree line. Marcus crawled into the back of his Subaru. I slid the Westie's door shut, leaving the window cracked just enough for air. Sleep didn't come cleanly. I drifted, woke, drifted again. Each time I surfaced, the silence felt heavier, more intentional. My ears strained for sound, any sound, and found almost nothing. Even my own breathing felt intrusive. Sometime after midnight, the smell changed. It crept in slowly, subtle enough that I questioned whether it was real. Sweet at first, almost artificial, then heavier, like plastic warming under stress. It settled in the back of my throat and stayed there. I sat up, heart already accelerating, and leaned toward the window. Still no smoke. That absence hit harder than the smell itself. Fire announces itself. It demands attention. This felt like something else entirely, something moving beneath the rules I trusted. I pulled on my boots and slid the door open. Cold rushed in, sharp and clean, and carrying that strange scent with it. My headlamp cut a narrow cone through the clearing. The ash on the ground looked paler now, almost luminous. Lena was already outside, her headlamp off, eyes adjusted to the dark. She stood still, listening. Marcus joined us moments later, his light jittery, breath visible in quick bursts. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. At first I didn't. Then it registered, a low, almost imperceptible hiss, not wind, not water. It moved sideways through the trees, like pressure releasing somewhere it shouldn't. We stood there longer than made sense, none of us willing to name what we were afraid of. Then, deep in the forest downslope, something cracked. Not a branch snapping under weight. A deeper sound. Wood splitting from the inside. It happened again, closer. The ground under my boots felt warm. That was when denial took over. I told myself it was nothing. Old burn scars. Settling earth. Anything that let me stay where I was instead of admitting we might already be standing on the edge of something that didn't care whether we understood it or not. The forest stayed silent. And then, faintly, far too controlled to be natural, a dull orange glow pulsed beneath the trees and disappeared. Still no smoke. The forest wasn't burning the way fire is supposed to. It was burning quietly, and we were right on top of it. The glow didn't linger. It pulsed once, then the forest swallowed it again, leaving our eyes struggling to prove it had been real. None of us spoke right away. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, like the land itself was waiting to see what we would do next. I became acutely aware of my own body, the way my pulse thudded in my ears, the way the soles of my boots felt warmer than the air around my ankles. That detail refused to be ignored. Lena was the first to move. She crouched and pressed her palm to the ground, holding it there longer than comfort allowed. When she stood, her face had changed. The calm she'd carried earlier, the local confidence had drained away, replaced by something sharper and more focused. "This isn't a surface fire," she said quietly. "It's underneath." Marcus frowned, still scanning the trees. "Like smoldering? Like roots," she said. "Peat, old burn scars, fire that never fully died." The idea settled into me slowly, each word adding weight. Fire that didn't roar. Fire that didn't announce itself with smoke and flame. Fire that traveled through the ground, patient and unseen, eating its way forward without urgency. The hiss returned, louder now. It wasn't constant. It came in waves like breath being forced through soil. The smell shifted again, losing its sweetness and gaining a harsh edge that made my eyes sting. I felt foolish standing there, headlamp cutting through nothing, as if light could solve a problem that wasn't happening above ground. "We should leave," Lena said. Not urgently, not panicked, just factual. Marcus hesitated. His car was parked farther back, closer to the tree line on the downhill side. He glanced toward it, then back at us. "I can grab it fast." Another crack echoed through the forest, closer this time, followed by a low rumble that vibrated through my legs. The ground near the creek bed shimmered, heat distorting the air just enough to notice if you were already afraid. "No," I said, louder than I meant to. "Leave it." The denial cracked then. Not all at once, but enough to let fear in properly. This wasn't something we could reason with. This wasn't a situation where better information would make it manageable. The forest had already made a decision. We were just late to understanding it. Marcus ran. He moved fast, boots pounding dirt that no longer felt solid. For a moment, the clearing was empty except for Lena and me, the van behind us, the forest ahead of us glowing faintly in patches like embers buried too deep to extinguish. The heat intensified. It wasn't searing, but it pressed against my face, against my shins, like standing near an open door to a furnace room. Still no smoke. That absence felt almost mocking now, as if the fire was daring us to rely on the wrong sense. Lena climbed into the passenger seat without being told. I slid behind the wheel, hands shaking as I shoved the key into the ignition. The engine coughed. Once. My stomach dropped. The hiss grew louder, spreading across the clearing. The ground trembled again, stronger this time, and somewhere to our right a tree groaned, its roots losing their grip on soil that was no longer solid. Marcus burst into view, sprinting hard, face pale in the headlamp beam, eyes wide with something close to panic, but not quite there yet. He dove into the back of the van as the engine finally caught, the familiar rattle sounding suddenly fragile. I slammed the door and threw the van into gear. The headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the forest road, illuminating dirt, roots, and dust that swirled strangely close to the ground. The van lurched forward, suspension complaining as we bounced over ruts I barely remembered driving in on. Behind us, the clearing pulsed orange again, brighter this time, light bleeding through soil and leaf litter in irregular patches. The forest wasn't on fire the way I understood fire. It was glowing from within, heat crawling outward along root systems like veins. The smell turned metallic and sharp, burning the back of my throat. My eyes watered, but still no smoke clouded the air. It felt wrong on a fundamental level, like reality had skipped a step. The road narrowed, trees pressing closer. I drove faster than I should have, the van shuddering with every bump. Branches scraped the sides, a sound that normally would have made me flinch, but now barely registered. The hiss followed us. Not directly, but everywhere. It seemed to come from the ground beneath the road, from the forest floor on either side, from the dark beyond the headlights. The heat surged and faded in waves like the land itself was breathing. Lena gripped the dashboard, knuckles white. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence carried the same message my instincts were screaming. Don't stop. A section of the road ahead shimmered, heat distorting the air above it. For a split second, I imagined the ground giving way entirely, the van dropping into something I couldn't see or name. I swerved instinctively, tires skidding on loose gravel, and corrected just in time. Marcus shouted from the back, a single word I couldn't make out over the engine and the pounding of my own heart. Then, just as suddenly as it had escalated, the heat began to fade. The hiss softened. The glow behind us dimmed, swallowed by distance and trees. The air cooled enough that I could breathe without pain. We didn't slow down until the road widened and the forest pulled back, the oppressive closeness giving way to open dark. I pulled into a turnout without thinking, hands still locked on the steering wheel long after the engine idled down. None of us spoke. The silence here felt different, not staged, not heavy, just empty. When I stepped out of the van, the cold bit immediately, sharp and honest. My boots met solid ground that felt like ground should. I looked back the way we'd come and saw nothing but darkness. In the headlights, a thin layer of gray dust coated the van's tires, the road, our clothes. Ash settled quietly, like it had been waiting for us to notice. The smell lingered on us even after the forest released us. By the time we reached cell service, an hour later, there were no alerts, no warnings, no record of anything happening where we'd been. The forest had kept its secret. In the days that followed, I learned more about fires that don't announce themselves, about underground burns that can last for months, even years, moving invisibly until something triggers them to surface, about how the most dangerous situations are often the ones that remove the signals we're trained to trust. I still camp. I still drive the Volkswagen into places where roads fade into intention rather than certainty. But now, when the air feels too clean, when the silence feels arranged instead of natural, I listen harder. I pay attention to the ground beneath my feet, to the way my body reacts before my mind has time to argue. Because in places like Klamath, danger doesn't always arrive loud and dramatic. Sometimes it burns quietly beneath you, waiting for you to notice what's missing. True tales, when the forest itself refused to be entered. The first sign something was wrong wasn't a sound or a shape. It was the way the road seemed to hesitate before letting me in. I'm not someone who believes the land has intentions, at least I didn't used to be. But that night, sitting behind the wheel of my Volkswagen bus with my hands resting on the cracked vinyl, I felt the forest pausing, as if deciding whether I belonged there at all. My name is Aaron Cole. I was 38 at the time, born and raised in Oregon, the kind of person who grew up believing trees were shelter, not warning signs. I'd spent years driving my old Volkswagen, faded sage green, slow on hills, faithful in every other way, into places most people only saw on postcards. Camping wasn't escape for me. It was alignment, or at least that's what I told myself. That trip was supposed to be simple. 3 nights in a national forest in Northern California, just across the state line. A place I'd heard about from another VW camper at a rest stop weeks earlier. He'd been vague in a way that felt deliberate, said the forest was intact, like that was a rare thing now. No crowds, no noise, just space. I didn't question why he wouldn't meet my eyes when he said it. By the time I turned off the highway, dusk had already flattened the color of the world. The access road was marked, but barely. An old wooden sign leaning at an angle, the lettering softened by years of rain. My headlights swept across it, and for a moment I thought the word enter was scratched over with something darker. But when I slowed and reversed to look again, it was just a knot in the wood. I told myself that. I told myself a lot of things that night. The road narrowed fast. Gravel gave way to dirt to something closer to packed soil and pine needles. The forest pressed in on both sides, tall enough that the remaining light vanished almost all at once. My Volkswagen strained uphill, engine whining in that familiar apologetic way, and I kept my foot steady, listening, feeling the vibration travel up through the pedals. That's when I noticed the smell. It wasn't rot, not decay. It was green, too green. Sharp and wet, like crushed leaves mixed with cold metal. It came through the vents even though I hadn't turned the fan on. I rolled down my window, expecting fresh air to clear it, but the smell thickened instead, coating the back of my throat. It made me think of unfinished places, of rooms you weren't supposed to seal yet. I laughed once, out loud, just to hear a human sound. It died quickly. About a mile in, the road forked without warning. No sign, no map marker. My GPS lost signal 10 minutes earlier, the screen frozen mid-recalculation. I stopped, engine idling, headlights illuminating 2 equally uninviting paths. The left sloped down into deeper shadow. The right curved gently, but the trees leaned toward it in a way that felt attentive. I chose right, not because it felt safer, but because it felt watched. I wanted to be seen. I didn't want to disappear quietly. The forest changed after that. I don't mean visually, not at first. It was the sound, or rather the absence of the usual ones. No insects, no wind. Even the hum of my engine felt muted, like the trees were absorbing it. When I shut the van off at a small clearing that barely qualified as a campsite, the silence snapped into place so hard it made my ears ring. I sat there longer than I meant to, hands still on the wheel, listening for something to resume. Nothing did. The clearing looked official enough, fire ring, flattened ground, but something about it felt recently abandoned. Not by people, by intention. I stepped out, boots crunching softly, and the air felt colder than it should have. Not nighttime cold, underground cold, the kind that seeps upward. I set up quickly, movements efficient, practiced. I'd done this 100 times. Pop the rear hatch, roll out the sleeping pad, hang the lantern. Each familiar action felt like a ritual meant to keep something else at bay. When the lantern clicked on, its warm circle of light felt almost defiant. The forest didn't respond. That was when I noticed the path. It started at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the fire ring, narrow and pressed flat like it had been walked repeatedly. It didn't appear on any map I'd seen. It didn't look like a game trail either. Too deliberate, too straight. It led into the trees and vanished after a few feet, swallowed whole. I stared at it longer than I should have, a strange pressure building behind my eyes, like the path was waiting for recognition. I didn't step onto it. Instead, I cooked dinner. Simple, canned chili heated on my camp stove, and ate standing up, back against the van, eyes scanning the dark. Every sound felt closer than it should have been, even my own breathing. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, slow and measured, pacing the perimeter of the clearing just beyond the reach of the lantern. I held my breath, listening harder, but the sound never repeated. The silence after felt intentional. Corrective. By the time I crawled into the van, my nerves were humming. I locked the doors, a habit I rarely bothered with, and lay on my back, staring at the ceiling. The smell returned then, stronger, seeping in through the seams, green and wet and metallic. I told myself it was moss, or sap, or my imagination, finally catching up with the isolation. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it wasn't rest. It was a series of shallow descents, each one ending with the same sensation. Resistance, like pushing against something that pushed back. I woke to a sound that didn't belong. Not an animal, not wind. It was a pressure sound, like a hand pressed flat against glass. Slow, deliberate. It came from the side of the van near the driver's door. I lay still, heart hammering, counting seconds between breaths. The sound didn't repeat. Instead, I felt it. A subtle shift, as if the ground itself had adjusted. When I finally worked up the nerve to look out the window, there was nothing there, just trees. Too many trees. They seemed closer than they had been before, trunks crowding the edge of the clearing, their shadows overlapping in ways that hadn't been there when I went to sleep. Morning never fully arrived. The sky lightened, but the sun didn't break through. The forest stayed dim, colors flattened and cold. When I stepped outside, the smell was gone, replaced by something worse. Nothing at all. No scent, like the air had been stripped. I packed up fast, didn't make coffee, didn't linger. As I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine hesitated. Once, twice. On the third try, it caught, but the sound was wrong, lower, strained. I didn't care. I just wanted out. I followed the road back the way I'd come. At least I thought I did. The fork appeared again, but now it was different. The left path was gone, overgrown, as if it had never existed. The right path, the one I'd taken, looked narrower, darker. I stopped, pulse pounding, and that's when I noticed the ground in front of the van. The soil was disturbed, freshly pressed, like something had stood there, waiting. The forest hadn't tried to scare me. It hadn't chased me or shown me teeth. It had done something far more unsettling. It had closed. I sat there longer than I should have, engine idling, staring at the place in the road where the ground looked pressed down, as if weight had been applied and then carefully removed. There were no footprints, no drag marks, just a subtle smoothness where the forest floor should have been chaotic. Pine needles lay flattened in a shallow oval, all pointing inward. That detail stuck with me more than anything else. Not scattered, not disturbed, oriented. I told myself it was runoff from rain I must have missed on the forecast. I told myself the trees hadn't moved, that distance plays tricks when you're tired. I told myself a lot of things because the alternative, that the forest was adjusting itself around me, wasn't something I was ready to accept. I eased the Volkswagen forward, tires crunching softly, and took the right path again. Almost immediately, the sense of wrongness intensified. The road felt longer this time, like the turns more frequent, the trees leaning in closer with every bend. My headlights barely reached 10 feet ahead, swallowed by trunks and low-hanging branches that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The engine temperature gauge crept upward, needle trembling just below the red. I turned off the heater, rolled down the window, and was hit with cold so sharp it felt like it cut. Then came the sound. At first, it was distant enough that I thought it was mechanical, a loose panel, a bad belt, a low rhythmic knocking that synced with my speed. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't coming from the engine. It wasn't coming from the suspension. It was coming from outside, off to the left, pacing me just beyond the tree line. I slowed. The sound slowed. I accelerated. The sound kept pace. My hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles white as a memory surfaced. Something an old ranger once told me during a fire season in Washington. He'd said, forests don't echo the way people think they do. Sound doesn't bounce randomly out there. It travels along paths, natural corridors. And sometimes he'd added, it finds you because you're already where it wants to go. The knocking stopped when I stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, like pressure building in my ears. I shut off the engine without thinking, the sudden quiet so complete it felt like the world had been muted. I listened, heart pounding, for anything, wind, birds, insects. There was nothing. Even my breath sounded wrong, too loud, too present. That's when I heard my name. Not spoken, not shouted. It was closer to a suggestion, a shaping of sound that implied familiarity. Aaron. It came from somewhere ahead, down the road, layered so subtly into the silence that I almost dismissed it as my own thoughts turning inward. I didn't answer. I turned the key again. The engine coughed, sputtered, then died. The dashboard lights flickered once and went dark. I tried again. Nothing. No click. No turnover. Just dead. Panic rose fast, sharp and immediate. I popped the hood and stepped out, the cold biting through my jacket. The forest felt closer now, the trees pressing in with a sense of anticipation I couldn't rationalize. I lifted the hood and stared at the engine, though I knew enough to recognize when knowledge wouldn't help. Everything looked intact. No loose wires, no obvious damage, just stillness. The knocking returned, closer this time, not pacing me now. Circling, it came different directions, never repeating the same spot twice. Left, behind, right, each knock spaced evenly apart, patient. Testing. I slammed the hood shut and backed toward the driver's door, eyes scanning the tree line. Shadows shifted where they shouldn't have, overlapping in ways that suggested depth where there was none. I made a decision then, not a good one, but the only one that felt available. I grabbed my pack, locked the van out of habit, and stepped onto the road on foot. The forest didn't react immediately. No surge of sound, no movement. It waited. The road curved ahead, disappearing into shadow. I walked, boots crunching softly, every step feeling like a negotiation. After a few minutes, the air changed again. Warmer now, humid. The smell returned, green, wet, metallic, but stronger, layered with something else. Iron, blood adjacent. My throat tightened. The path appeared again, branching off the road to my right, the same one from the clearing, narrow, pressed flat, deliberate. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I stood at the junction, pulse racing, and felt the pull of it, not physical, but psychological, an insistence. Like the forest was offering me an alternative. I didn't take it. I stayed on the road, forcing myself forward, counting steps, focusing on the rhythm of movement to keep my thoughts from spiraling. The knocking followed, always just out of sight, never rushing, never retreating. At one point, I thought I heard a second voice layered beneath it, not speaking words, but shaping sound into something almost like reassurance, almost like welcome. My foot caught on something and I stumbled, catching myself just before I fell. I looked down and felt my stomach drop. The road behind me was gone. Not blocked, not obscured, gone. Where I'd just walked was now forest floor, thick, undisturbed, layered with needles and moss that looked decades old. No sign of disturbance, no path, just trees. The panic that hit then was total. I ran. I don't know how long I ran. Time collapsed into breath and impact and the burn in my legs. The knocking became a chorus, surrounding me, overlapping, never quite sinking. My vision tunneled, the edges darkening, and I burst into another clearing without warning, nearly slamming into the trees on the far side. This clearing was different. No fire ring. No flattened ground. Just an open space where the trees stopped abruptly, their trunks forming a near-perfect circle around the perimeter. The air here was warmer, heavier, pressing down on my shoulders. In the center of the clearing was nothing. No structure, no object, just bare earth, smooth and dark like it had been turned recently. I knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic, that this was the place the path had been leading to. The knocking stopped. In the silence that followed, I felt something else instead. Attention, focused and complete. The forest wasn't closing in anymore. It was holding its breath. I stood at the edge of the clearing, shaking, every instinct screaming at me not to step forward. Memories surfaced then, not just from this trip, but from years of camping, of moments when I'd ignored a bad feeling because it didn't fit my plans, because I didn't want to be inconvenienced, because I believed experience made me immune to warning. The lesson came too late, but it came clearly. Some places aren't dangerous because of what's in them. They're dangerous because they don't want you. I stood there at the edge of that clearing long enough for my legs to start trembling on their own, not from exhaustion, though that was there, but from the strain of holding myself back. Every instinct I had was split in two. One half screamed to run, to crash blindly through the trees and accept whatever damage came with it. The other half, quieter and far more dangerous, urged me forward, not with force, with certainty, with the calm assurance of something that knew I would eventually understand. The air in the clearing felt layered, thick like humidity before a storm, but there were no clouds above. When I tilted my head back, the sky looked wrong, too uniform, like a stretched canvas instead of open space. No birds crossed it. No sound moved through it. The forest ringed the clearing in perfect symmetry, the trees equidistant from one another, trunks straight and unscarred, as if they'd been selected rather than grown. I took one step forward before I realized I was doing it. The ground under my boot felt warmer than the surrounding soil, almost pliable, like it had been recently worked. Not dug, prepared. I froze, heart hammering, and waited for something to happen. Nothing did. No sound, no movement, just that oppressive sense of being evaluated. I forced myself to step back. The relief was immediate and physical, like pressure lifting from my chest. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. This place wanted consent. That realization cracked something open inside me. Fear shifted shape, sharpening into clarity. Whatever this forest was, whatever rules it followed, it wasn't mindless, it wasn't random, and it wasn't chasing me, it was redirecting. I backed away from the clearing slowly, never turning my back on it, eyes locked on that dark, bare patch of earth. The moment my heel crossed back onto the forest floor beyond the ring of trees, the air changed again. Cooler, thinner, easier to breathe. I didn't stop until my back hit a trunk, rough bark biting through my jacket. The knocking returned almost immediately, but it was different now, slower, more deliberate. It came from the trees behind the clearing, then from the sides, then from somewhere much farther away, a perimeter being reestablished. I realized then that I wasn't being herded toward the clearing anymore. I was being released. The understanding landed with a weight that made my knees buckle. This wasn't mercy, it was dismissal. I moved carefully, choosing a direction that felt the least resistant. Not open, not welcoming, just neutral. The forest responded by loosening its grip. The trees spaced out slightly. The ground became uneven again, littered with fallen branches and rocks that felt reassuringly random. Sound began to seep back in, faint at first. Wind in the upper canopy, the distant snap of a branch breaking under its own weight. I walked for what felt like hours, though my watch had stopped at some point. I didn't remember when. My thoughts kept circling the same realization. The forest hadn't tried to harm me because it didn't need to. It controlled access. It controlled movement, and when it was done with you, it simply returned you. The road reappeared without warning. One moment I was weaving between trees, the next my boot hit gravel. I nearly fell again, shock stealing my balance. The road looked ordinary, worn, imperfect, beautiful in its imperfection. I dropped to my knees and pressed my hands into it, grounding myself in the cold, unyielding reality of it. I followed it at a jog, then a run, lungs burning, ignoring the pain until the shape of my Volkswagen came into view through the trees. It was exactly where I'd left it. Too exactly. The van sat centered in the road, angled just slightly toward the trees, like it had been repositioned for presentation. No tracks led to or from it. The forest floor around it was pristine. I slowed, every nerve firing, scanning for signs of damage or interference. The doors were still locked, the windows intact, nothing visibly wrong. I unlocked the driver's door and climbed in, hands shaking so badly I had to grip the steering wheel to steady them. The interior smelled normal again, fabric, dust, old coffee, familiar, human. I turned the key without letting myself think. The engine started immediately. No hesitation, no strain. The temperature gauge sat comfortably low. Every system read normal, as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait to question it. I put the van in gear and drove. The forest didn't stop me. The road widened gradually, curves softening, trees pulling back into something that resembled a natural distribution. Sunlight finally broke through the canopy in fractured beams, catching dust in the air and making it sparkle. I kept driving until I hit pavement, then drove some more, not stopping until I reached a gas station an hour later. The attendant asked if I was okay, said I looked pale. I told him I'd had a rough night. I didn't camp for a long time after that. When I did, I changed the way I chose places. I stopped trusting recommendations that came without context. I stopped pushing past discomfort just to prove something to myself. Most importantly, I stopped believing that every open space was meant to be occupied. Some forests aren't hostile, they're selective. They don't attack intruders, they assess them. And if they decide you don't belong, they don't need to trap you forever. They only need to show you how easily they could. I still drive my Volkswagen. I still believe in the value of solitude, of quiet places where the noise of the world falls away. But now, when a road feels hesitant, when the air shifts, when sound thins, when instinct tightens its grip, I listen. Because the most dangerous places aren't the ones that threaten to kill you. They're the ones that simply refuse to let you stay. I didn't tell anyone the full story for a long time. Not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, but because I was afraid of how easily they might explain it away. Dead zones, equipment failure, stress, sleep deprivation. I'd spent enough time around rational people to know how quickly meaning gets sanded down until it's harmless. And what happened to me wasn't harmless. It didn't follow me home in a physical way, but it rewired something fundamental in how I understood wild places and myself inside them. Weeks later, back in Oregon, I took the Volkswagen out for a short, familiar trip. Same coast I'd driven dozens of times, same pullouts, same rhythm. I told myself it was about reclaiming confidence, but the truth was simpler. I needed to know whether what I felt now was fear or awareness. The first night was uneventful, almost aggressively normal. Wind in the grass. Waves breaking in the distance. I slept deeply, dreamlessly, and woke with that rare feeling of being fully inside my body again. That should have reassured me. Instead, it sharpened the contrast. On the second night, I pulled into a Forest Service campground I'd used before. Nothing remote, nothing unmarked. Families had camped there. I knew that. Still, when I shut off the engine, I stayed seated longer than usual, letting my senses stretch outward. The forest sounded right, alive. Chaotic in the way healthy things are. But beneath that, there was something else. A subtle pressure, barely perceptible, like a hand resting on the back of my thoughts. I didn't ignore it. I stepped out, walked the perimeter, noted the way the ground felt under my boots. Uneven. Honest. I smelled sap and dirt and old leaves. Nothing metallic, nothing stripped. When I stood still, the forest didn't seem to react. It didn't lean in, it didn't adjust. It simply existed. That was the difference. What I'd encountered before wasn't wilderness in the way we romanticize it. It wasn't indifferent. It wasn't passive. It was curated, maintained. A place with boundaries so old and so deeply ingrained that my presence hadn't been an intrusion. It had been a disruption. I left that campground early the next morning, not because I was afraid, but because I understood something I hadn't before. Comfort isn't the same thing as permission. In the months that followed, I started noticing patterns, stories shared quietly at trailheads, campers who spoke in half sentences about places they wouldn't return to, Rangers who redirected hikers without explanation, forests that never quite made it into guidebooks, even though they sat squarely on public land. When I listened closely, really listened, the language was always the same. The land didn't feel right. The trail kept changing. It was like the forest was watching. We've trained ourselves to dismiss those statements because they don't fit into a world measured by maps and permits and GPS coordinates. But the truth is, long before we had any of that, survival depended on reading subtle signals, shifts in sound, changes in air, the sudden absence of birds. We didn't evolve to conquer environments. We evolved to negotiate with them. That forest in Northern California reminded me of that in the most direct way possible. It didn't hurt me. It didn't chase me. It didn't even scare me in the way people expect fear to look. It showed me restraint, control, and the unsettling reality that I was never in danger because I was never in charge. I think about the clearing sometimes, about that smooth, dark earth, and the certainty that stepping into it would have been a choice I couldn't undo. Not because something would have attacked me, but because something would have accepted me. Not as a guest, not as a camper, as material. That's the part people don't like to hear. We assume danger looks aggressive, loud, violent, but some of the most dangerous things in this world are quiet, patient, and perfectly willing to wait for you to misunderstand them. I still camp. I still seek out places where cell signals die and the night feels enormous. I still believe there is value in being small inside something vast, but now I move differently. I arrive differently. I listen before I claim space. And when a place feels resistant, when the air tightens, when sound thins, when the road seems to hesitate, I leave. Not because I'm afraid, because I've learned that not every place is meant to be entered. Some forests are thresholds, not destinations. Some landscapes aren't invitations, but tests. And sometimes the most important lesson a place can teach you isn't how to survive it. It's how to walk away intact. The first night, the silence felt crowded, like the dark was holding its breath just to see how long I could pretend I didn't notice. I've learned that real fear doesn't arrive screaming. It arrives politely, almost apologetically, the way a stranger clears their throat behind you when you're blocking the aisle. You tell yourself it's nothing. You keep doing what you were doing. That's how it starts. My name is Aaron Cole. I was 42 that year, divorced, tired in a way sleep doesn't fix, and driving an aging Class C RV that rattled when the wind hit it wrong. I grew up in Eastern Oregon, the kind of place where distance teaches you patience and quiet teaches you to listen. Camping wasn't a hobby for me. It was muscle memory. When life got loud, I went where nothing talked back. That trip, I chose Hell's Canyon because it was supposed to feel empty. I told people I was heading out to clear my head, but the truth was simpler. I wanted to be somewhere vast enough to make my problems feel small. The sleeping basin sat deep inside the canyon, a wide valley carved between brutal ridgelines, accessible only by a service road that barely deserved the name. No hookups, no camp host, no cell signal. The kind of place you don't end up by accident. By the time I rolled in, dusk had already pulled the color out of the land. The canyon walls rose on both sides like ribs, dark and uneven, trapping the last light low against the basin floor. My headlights cut through sagebrush and loose gravel, and when I finally shut off the engine, the sudden quiet rang in my ears. That was the first thing I noticed. The quiet wasn't clean. It pressed. It felt thick, like the air before a storm, except the sky was clear and starless, swallowed by the canyon's shape. I stepped outside, boots crunching softly, and the smell hit me right away. Cold earth, dry grass, something mineral and old. And underneath it, faint but unmistakable, a dampness that didn't belong in a place this arid, like breathing near a cave mouth. I told myself it was the river far below, moisture drifting up the canyon walls. Rational explanations are comforting that way. They give you something to lean on. I leveled the RV, set my jacks, and went through my routine. Generator off, lights low, doors checked twice. Habit over thought. Inside, the space felt smaller than usual. The walls creaked as the temperature dropped, the metal popping softly like knuckles cracking in the dark. I cooked a simple meal and ate standing up, eyes drifting to the window more often than my plate. Outside, the basin lay open and empty, moonlight barely touching the ground. No fire pits nearby, no tire tracks but my own. Just me, the RV, and a valley that felt attentive. When the first sound came, it was so subtle I almost missed it. A long exhale. Not wind. Wind moves across surfaces, rustles brush, whistles around edges. This sound came from below, from the ground itself, a slow release of air that made the grass shiver in ripples. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth, listening. It happened again, deeper this time, like a chest emptying. I laughed quietly, mostly to hear a human sound. Thermal shift, I muttered. Rock cooling. I'd heard stranger things in the desert at night. Sound carries. The canyon plays tricks. Still, I shut the blinds. Sleep didn't come easily. The mattress felt too firm, the air too cold. Every small noise snapped me awake, the tick of cooling metal, the faint hum of the propane system. Somewhere outside, something brushed against the RV, light and deliberate. A hand-sized pressure, sliding, then gone. I held my breath, listening. Nothing followed. No footsteps, no animal sounds, just that dense silence again, wrapping itself around the RV like insulation. I told myself it was a deer or a cow that wandered up from lower ground. Hell's Canyon had feral cattle. Everyone knew that. I repeated it until my heart slowed. Sometime after midnight, the valley breathed again. This time, it lasted longer. The RV rocked gently, not from wind, but from a pressure change that made my ears pop. The smell returned, stronger now, wet stone, old leaves, something like iron. My stomach tightened with a memory I couldn't place. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there, eyes open, counting seconds between breaths that weren't mine. Morning came gray and reluctant, sunlight spilling over the ridges in narrow bands. The basin looked harmless in daylight, wide, dry, ordinary, embarrassingly so. Fear shrinks under the sun. I stepped outside and did a slow walk around the RV. No tracks, no scratches, just my own boot prints from the night before. The grass lay flattened in places, as if something heavy had settled there for a while, then moved on. I packed up my gear to hike down toward the river, thinking movement would shake the unease loose. The trail was faint but visible, winding through scrub and loose shale. As I descended, the air grew cooler, heavier. Sound behaved strangely. My footsteps echoed too long, then vanished entirely, swallowed by the canyon's curves. Halfway down, I found the first sign that made my skin prickle. A deer carcass lay wedged between rocks, bloated, eyes gone, ribcage split open, not by teeth but by force, as if something had pressed down until the bones gave way. No scavenger marks, no blood trail, just collapse. I stood there longer than I should have, studying it, trying to make it fit into something familiar. Cougar? Bear? But predators tear. They bite. They drag. This thing looked compressed. I felt watched then, not seen, measured. The sensation crept up my spine, and I turned slowly, scanning the canyon walls. Nothing moved. The rocks stared back, indifferent. I hiked back up faster than I meant to, lungs burning, heart pounding harder with every step. By the time the RV came into view, I was sweating despite the cold. I considered leaving. The thought came fully formed, clear and reasonable. Pack up, drive out, call it a bad vibe and go somewhere else. Instead, I stayed. That's the part people don't like to admit, that fear doesn't always make you run. Sometimes it challenges you. Sometimes it dares you to prove you're still in control. That night, I built a small fire in the pit near the RV. Flames snapping in the dark. The light pushed the shadows back, but they pressed in close, crowding the edge of the glow. The valley felt closer now, the canyon walls leaning in, listening. When the breathing started again, it synced with the fire. Each exhale made the flames bow outward, flattening as if a giant hand pressed down from above. The ground vibrated under my boots, subtle but undeniable. I stood up, pulse roaring in my ears, and for the first time I said it out loud. No. The word vanished into the night, swallowed whole. The fire died suddenly, smothered by a rush of cold air that smelled like the inside of a cave. The darkness rushed back, complete and immediate. In it, Something shifted, not moving across the ground, but rising, displacing space. I ran. I don't remember reaching the RV, only slamming the door and throwing the deadbolt, hands shaking so hard I missed it twice. Inside, the walls creaked under pressure, not from wind, but from something leaning close, testing. The breathing filled the RV, loud now, intimate. Every inhale drew warmth out of the space, frosting the windows from the outside in. I clutched my keys, my phone, anything solid. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, like a held note that never resolves. I stayed awake until dawn, engine running, headlights on, ready to drive through anything that stepped into the road. When the sun finally crested the ridge, the valley released me. I left without breakfast, without looking back. The road out felt longer than it should have, the canyon reluctant to let go. When I finally hit pavement and cell signal returned, my phone buzzed with missed messages, reminders of a world that felt unreal now. I've camped since then. I still love the quiet, the distance, the way the land strips you down to essentials. But I listen differently now. Some places aren't empty. Some places are resting. And if you stay too long breathing their air, they might start breathing you in. So when the silence feels crowded, when the ground exhales under your feet, trust that instinct. Pack up. Move on. Because not every valley wants company. Some of them are just sleeping. I thought leaving would end it, that distance would thin whatever had pressed so close in that basin. But fear doesn't work like geography. It rides with you. It sits in the passenger seat and watches the road unwind. The service road out of Sleeping Basin snaked along the canyon wall, narrow enough that my tires kissed the edge more than once. To my right, the land dropped away into shadow, the river hidden but loud, a constant low rush like blood moving through a body too big to see. I drove with both hands locked on the wheel, shoulders tight, eyes flicking to the mirrors every few seconds, half expecting to see the valley rising behind me like a tide. The RV felt different in motion. Heavy, resistant, like it didn't want to climb. The engine strained harder than it should have on inclines I'd handled before. Temperature gauge creeping up. The smell of hot oil leaking into the cab. I told myself it was altitude, age, bad timing. Still, I kept my foot steady, coaxing rather than forcing. About 3 miles from the basin, the road leveled out briefly, passing through a cut where the canyon walls pressed close on both sides. Rock faces leaned inward, blotting out the sky. The air there was colder, damp enough to beat on the windshield. I slowed without meaning to. That was when I heard it again. Not the breathing, not exactly. This was closer to a rhythm, a pulse, a deep internal thump that didn't come through the air so much as through the frame of the RV. Each beat made the steering wheel tremble, the mirrors shiver. I pulled over. The decision surprised me as much as anything. Later, I'd wonder why I stopped instead of flooring it, why I let fear turn me curious. But in that moment, it felt necessary, like ignoring it would be worse. I shut off the engine. The sudden quiet made my ears ring. The pulse continued. I stepped out, boots scraping on gravel, and the smell rolled over me. Wet stone, old growth, that same iron tang, stronger here, concentrated. The canyon walls seemed closer now, surfaces slick with dark streaks that hadn't been there before, like condensation on skin. The ground under my feet vibrated faintly, in time with the pulse. I pressed my palm against the rock face. It was warm. Not sun-warmed, alive warm. Heat radiating from within, subtle but unmistakable. I jerked my hand back, heart slamming hard enough to hurt. That's when I understood. The basin hadn't been breathing because it was empty. It had been breathing because it was full. Full of something moving too slowly to notice unless you stayed still long enough. Something that didn't walk or crawl but expanded and contracted, using the shape of the land the way lungs use ribs. Valleys weren't just places to it. They were organs. The pulse deepened, slowed, each beat heavier than the last. Pebbles skittered down the canyon walls. Somewhere below, the river's sound shifted pitch, drawn into the rhythm. I backed toward the RV, eyes never leaving the rock face. The warmth spread outward now, the air thickening, pressure building until my ears rang again. I fumbled for the door handle, fingers clumsy, vision tunneling. Behind me, something exhaled, not from a mouth, from everywhere at once. The canyon released a wave of air so cold it burned, slamming into my back, shoving me forward into the RV's side. I gasped, lungs seizing, breath ripped out of me like it belonged to the land now. I didn't think. I reacted. I hauled myself inside, slammed the door, and turned the key in one violent motion. The engine roared to life, gauges spiking, lights flickering. I threw it into gear and hit the gas, tires spinning before catching, the RV lurching forward as if breaking free from suction. The pulse chased me, not faster, steadier, persistent. The road curved and climbed, canyon walls slowly widening, sky leaking back in pale strips. With every yard gained, the vibration weakened, the warmth fading, the smell thinning, until it was just dust and exhaust again. When I finally reached the overlook where the service road met the main highway, I pulled over and killed the engine, chest heaving. I sat there a long time, hands shaking, staring out over the canyon. From that distance, it looked unchanged, vast, beautiful, harmless. The river glittered far below, a silver thread. The sleeping basin lay hidden beyond a fold of land, invisible from here. I laughed then, short and sharp, the sound of someone realizing too late how close they came to something they couldn't name. "You're tired," I told myself. "That's all." Your mind filled in the blanks. But my palm still tingled where it had touched the rock, heat lingering deep under the skin. I drove straight through to Boise that day, checking into a crowded RV park on the edge of town, surrounded by lights, noise, people who waved and smiled and asked where I'd come from. I smiled back, nodded, gave vague answers. I slept with the TV on, volume low, the constant murmur grounding me. Weeks passed, then months. Life resumed its familiar shape. Work deadlines, groceries, traffic. I told the story once, late at night over beers with an old friend, framing it as a weird trip, nerves getting the better of me. He laughed, said the canyon messes with people, always has. I let it drop, but I started noticing things. How certain valleys felt heavier than others. How some low places held cold even under summer sun. How the ground sometimes seemed to hum faintly underfoot if I stood still long enough. I began reading geology papers, old survey notes, indigenous oral histories I'd never bothered with before. Stories about places that sleep, about land that moves when watched, about valleys avoided not because they were dangerous, but because they were sacred in a way that demanded distance. One account stuck with me, an old ranger's journal entry from the early 1900s. He wrote about Hell's Canyon as if it were an animal, described the way sound behaved oddly in certain basins, how campfires died without wind, how livestock refused to graze in specific low areas no matter how lush the grass looked. He ended the entry with a line I still hear in my head sometimes. "The land breathes here. Best not to stand in its lungs." I stopped free camping after that, stopped chasing emptiness. When I do go out now, I choose places with people nearby, noise, signs of movement. I still love the road, the independence, the way an RV can feel like a small, mobile world. But I respect the silence differently, because silence isn't absence. Sometimes it's a warning. If you camp long enough, you learn to read the land the way sailors read the sea. Most of the time, it's generous, honest. But every once in a while, you find a place that isn't meant to host you, a place that uses you the way it uses wind or water, briefly, without malice, without care. When that happens, leaving isn't weakness, it's wisdom. So if you ever find yourself deep in a canyon, parked in a valley that feels too still, where the air presses and the quiet feels crowded, listen to that small voice telling you to go. Don't wait for proof. Don't demand an explanation. Some parts of this country are older than fear, older than us, and still very much alive. And they don't need you to believe in them. They only need you to stay. I didn't tell anyone the rest of it for a long time because the rest of it didn't happen all at once. It leaked into my life slowly, the way cold seeps into a house through bad insulation. You don't notice it at first. You just find yourself wearing a jacket indoors, wondering when that started to feel normal. The first sign came months later in a place that shouldn't have reminded me of Hell's Canyon at all. I was parked overnight at a busy campground outside Moab, Red Rock country, dry and open, the opposite of that suffocating basin. There were kids riding bikes in circles, generators humming, someone playing classic rock too loud from a fifth wheel down the row. Safe. Ordinary. I slept fine that night, really slept, for the first time in a while. Just before dawn, I woke up gasping. My chest felt tight, like something had been sitting on it. The air inside the RV felt wrong, too thick, too warm, carrying that same mineral dampness I remembered from the canyon. For a split second, still half dreaming, I was sure the valley had followed me. I sat up fast, heart racing, and the sensation broke. The air thinned, the smell vanished. All that remained was my own breathing, loud and uneven in the small space. I laughed it off, rubbed my face, blamed stress. Night terrors aren't uncommon when you're living on the road, when routines shift and your body forgets where safe is supposed to be. I made coffee, watched the sunrise burn the cliffs orange, and moved on. But it happened again. Not every night. Not even often. Just enough to make me uneasy. I'd wake with the sense of pressure, the impression of being inside something rather than on it. Sometimes there was a faint vibration like a distant engine idling underground. Sometimes there was that smell, faint but unmistakable, lingering for a few seconds after I opened my eyes. What scared me wasn't the sensations themselves. It was the pattern. It only happened when I parked low. Valleys, basins, river bottoms, places where the land folded inward, on higher ground, ridgelines, open plains, nothing. Sleep came clean and dreamless. But dropped down into a bowl of land, even a shallow one, and the unease crept back, subtle as a change in barometric pressure. I started adjusting without consciously deciding to. I'd bypass cheaper campsites near water and pay more for spots on bluffs. I'd drive an extra hour to sleep above tree line rather than settle into a sheltered hollow. Friends teased me about it when we met up, said I'd gone soft, afraid of a little weather. I didn't correct them, because the truth was harder to explain. I didn't feel hunted. I felt remembered. That's the word that fits best. Like the valley in Hell's Canyon hadn't chased me out of anger, but recognition. Like I'd stood in the wrong place long enough for something slow and vast to register my presence, the way your body registers a splinter days after it lodges under the skin. I went back to Oregon the following spring against my better judgment. Not to the canyon, never there, but to see my sister, to remind myself that roots still mattered. One afternoon, we drove out to a familiar overlook, a place we'd visited as kids, high above a winding river. The land spread out below us in gentle waves, green and gold. She leaned on the railing and sighed. "Feels good to breathe out here," she said. "Doesn't it?" The words hit me harder than they should have. I looked down at the valley below, at the way mist pooled along the river like a living thing, slow and deliberate. For just a moment I imagined it rising, filling the space between the hills, pressing upward. "Yeah," I said finally. "It does." But my chest felt tight again, just for a second, and I stepped back from the railing without thinking. That night, lying awake in my old childhood bedroom, I realized something that made the fear shift into something else, something heavier. The valley in Hell's Canyon hadn't been unique. It had just been awake. Land changes over time. Pressure builds, faults slip, water carves. We think of those processes as slow, inert, geological. But what if some places cross a threshold? What if the scale is so different that we mistake movement for stillness, breath for wind, awareness for coincidence? What if some valleys aren't empty spaces between hills, but chambers? I don't pretend to understand it fully. I don't chase explanations anymore. I've learned that understanding isn't required for survival. Attention is. These days, when I camp, I pay close attention to how my body reacts to a place before my mind catches up. I notice how sound behaves, whether it scatters or lingers. I pay attention to smells that don't match the climate, to ground that feels warmer than it should at night, to animals that avoid areas without obvious reason. And if the silence feels crowded, If the air presses back when I breathe, I leave. No argument, no pride, no need to prove anything to myself or the land. Because the lesson Hell's Canyon taught me wasn't about monsters or curses or hidden forces waiting to attack the careless. It was simpler and more unsettling than that. We move through this country thinking we're observers, visitors, temporary. But some places don't see us that way. Some places incorporate us into their systems, briefly and indifferently, the way lungs use air or rivers use rain. They don't mean harm. They don't mean anything at all. And that's what makes them dangerous. So if you love RV camping, the freedom, the quiet, the way the road strips life down to what you can carry, hold on to that. Don't let fear steal it from you. Just remember this. Not every open space is an invitation. Not every quiet place is at rest. And sometimes the safest choice isn't pushing deeper into the wilderness. It's recognizing when the land is already breathing and choosing not to stand in its lungs.